Our next speaker, Daniel Zach, is going to talk to us a little bit about knights and samurai.
Okay, so my name is Daniel. I love history and I love talking about history, but unfortunately nobody wants to listen to history unless you talk about war and blood and guts. So I'm going to sell out and talk about the two most famous soldiers in all of history, the knight in shining armor and the silent samurai, right? From European culture and Japanese culture. So when we think about them, they are almost the same story in our heads, right? They're both these sort of noblemen who were born to be soldiers that would go into combat bravely with swords, and all these legends would be written about them. They would go through intense training from, almost the day of birth, etc., etc. So let's look at how much of that is accurate and to what extent. So the thing about them being nobles is true, and because of that, they were kind of the only people in their respective cultures who knew how to read and write. So they wrote the legends about themselves. So if I could write legends about myself, I would be super cool too, right? And so they wrote all these legends about themselves, charging into warfare with their handcrafted swords, right? The long sword and the katana are very famous in popular culture. So the reason they wrote about these things is because they were very portable weapons that you could wear at all times. And so it became a status symbol. Like, look at me, I'm armed even while I'm talking to you because I'm such a warrior. But the thing is that when samurai and knights came onto the scene, which is 11th, 12th centuries, they had already invented something called armor. And people wore armor because it worked. And a sword simply cannot get through armor. It doesn't matter how hard you try. I mean, you could get in between the plates. Swords were not really used in warfare for the last 1,000 years. They just didn't use it unless all other weapons just broke for some reason. So how would they fight? This is the Bayern Tapestry, which shows the invasion by the Normans of Britain. The knights would charge in a group with spears against other people who didn't have swords either, and would either break their lances or continue. And then they would run back and get new lances. And they would kind of do hit and runs. They would not get bogged down in a close quarters fight. I mean, they were expensive. If they had to fight on foot, they would use this, which is called a halberd. And you can see you can do the choppy with it. You can do the pokey thing here. I'm a historian. And you can do the smashy smash over here. So this could actually get through armor if you tried hard enough. Now, what about the samurai? So this is an oil on canvas. And you can see that what they would do is they would ride around on horses with a bow and arrow. And they would try to shoot people in the back, essentially. So again, trying to keep their distance from the actual fight because these were, expensive soldiers, and shoot from a range. So that's what was useful about them. If they had to fight on foot, they would use something called a yari, which could, poke them a bunch of times from a distance. And you would have a bunch of dudes with these things and just force them into a corner until you could find breaking their armor. So with these samurai, the thing that they're also famous for is Bushido, right? This complicated code of honor. The most famous thing is that they would never surrender. They would never retreat. And if they lost a battle, they would slice open their own stomachs and kill themselves in something called seppuku, right? The thing is that we get that from samurai stories, which were written during the Edo period of Japan, which is from about 1600 to 1870. So almost 300 years. And during this time, the arts flourished in Japan. Rituals became bigger, big architectural development because there was no war. It was a period of peace in Japan. And so samurai became tax collectors and administrators. So during this time, they were writing about how I would rather kill myself than surrender, blah, 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 blah. But of course, there was no actual war to prove it. When war did break out in the 1870s, there was huge amounts of technology, machine guns, artillery, and the samurai pretty much didn't fight. If they did, they fought as officers, and they surrendered and retreated just like normal soldiers. And the samurai sort of went into obscurity. They weren't really talked about much until Japan had a little bit of a fascist phase, in the early 1900s, late 1800s. And they saw this story of the soldier who never surrenders as very useful to convince their soldiers to keep fighting even though they were outgunned. So that's where a lot of the modern samurai legends come from, is this type of Japanese propaganda during that period. Now, what about the knights? They had chivalry, right? A knight was supposed to be the ultimate Christian warrior, whatever that means. And they would be as daring in combat as they were gentle with women, which is the part people always mention when they say, oh, chivalry is dead. The thing is that chivalry was always dead. When chivalry was first written about, they were talking about an age that they already considered gone by. The King Arthur's court, which probably didn't actually exist. And they were writing about how they acted and how we wish knights of today would act that way because they totally didn't. And the modern version of chivalry comes from Don Quixote, which is a Spanish story about a crazy dude who thinks he's a knight. And that's where the modern story of chivalry comes from. So far, what we've gotten from this is that they were both not as cool as we thought, right? But I can see in a lot of people's eyes here, like, but did they ever actually fight? Like, who would win? That's what people want to know, right? And did they ever fight? Sort of, kind of. It depends on how you count it. But there are two instances in history. Number one was in the late 1500s, when a Spanish ship of conquistadors, who weren't all knights, but they used the same sort of knightly stuff, and some of them were actual knights, were sailing around Japan, and they saw a Japanese shipping boat, and they decided to raid it. And so they boarded it, only to find that the boat was carrying samurai. Little bit of a whoopsie, right? And so a big fight began. The samurai fought them and forced them off their boat. They ran away back to their boat. The samurai chased them onto their boat, started fighting. But then these conquistadors, they took those long pointy thingies again, and they made like a shield around the cabin and was able to fight them off, but only after half of their crew and their captain died. So that was a draw. Later, this Japanese guy was seen getting into a fight with this conquistador in Acapulco, Mexico, by this Aztec lord / historian. And they got into a fight, and the Japanese guy stabbed him. And that sounds like a weird thing, right? Like a Japanese guy fighting a conquistador in Mexico. And you might ask, what language were they fighting in? Portuguese, obviously. Like, come on. I'm serious, it was. So overall, there's only really been 2 fights between them, and it was 1-1. And that's the truth about samurai and knights.
Wow, thank you, Daniel, for giving a whole new definition to nerd knight. Are there any?
And thank you for summarizing my speech very well.
Are there any questions for Daniel? Yes. Oh, so the question is, who would win between knights and ninjas?
Okay, good question. Technically, ninja were a type of samurai. They were also the noble samurai who decided to become spies instead of fighters, right? We imagine them like wearing like that black uniform that we always see them, but of course spies don't wear uniforms, so they didn't wear that. And their job, they would usually just dress like civilians and watch things and take notes. So I would put forward that a ninja who got into sword fights a lot was a bad ninja. So the knight would win. Ninjas were not fighters. They almost never did assassinations either, by the way. That's the thing they're famous for. But assassinations don't work in feudal societies because the dude's son takes over. But anyway.
Yeah, and in case you're wondering, nerd ninjas would totally kick our ass. All right, any other questions? Yes. Sorry, can you repeat that?
Which one was superior?
So which one was technically superior?
The katana or the longsword? Okay, so the katana, you notice it has a curved shape, right? And the samurai would wear it with the blade pointing up. The reason for that, the reason the katana was designed that way was so that the samurai could draw it and swing at the same time. That was the function of a katana. The longsword, you wouldn't be able to do that. It would take more time to draw it. So the samurai was kind of like a cowboy, like quick draw, right? So it's very different functions. Both of them were mostly used to kill like peasants that insulted you. But in the end, the quality of iron was higher in Europe. I wonder if that played into history. And the longsword was a stronger blade than the katana.
All right, any other questions? Yes. So the question is, who had a faster pace of innovation in warfare? Was it the Japanese and the samurai or the Europeans and the knights?
I think everybody innovates at the same rate based on what they're dealing with. So Japan was an island that didn't have to deal with too much. And actually, for a long time, Japanese warfare was mostly like isolated duels and small skirmishes. And only when the Mongols managed to build ships did they start like doing modern military tactics, what we would call modern military tactics. But besides that, I mean, they were both adapted. If you weren't any warfare method not adapting to the war you're doing, you lose. So just by nature of being around, they were both adapting at the same speed.
So I have a question. Were the ones who fought with the weapons always knights as part of an army, or were some of them freelancers?
There were freelance knights, but it was considered like a huge level of dishonor to be like that. So they probably wouldn't even call themselves knights, unlike samurai who would call themselves ronin, and that wasn't too dishonorable. But yeah, they would still have to fight with an army. And every knight, by the way, had like a 30-person crew, like to feed their horses, put on their armor. It was like a modern tank. It needed a whole group of people to support. So a knight on his own can't really do much. He can't even lift his own spear because he can't do this. So he'd have to have like a caddy with a bunch of spears behind to like hand him new ones throughout the fight.
Cool, interesting. And final question, Take. Ooh, okay. So basically, Take, our resident samurai, has said that him and his brethren were fighting scum until 1960. Can the Europeans compete with their lowly knights?
Well, the problem is that because knights have entered into such mythology, there's a lot of people who like to think of themselves as knights. Like the most famous one, and sorry to bring them up, like the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. They would tell you they're knights, like they're defending from whatever, just like King Arthur did, I guess. I don't know. And then you might have some nobles who claim to be from a noble line, but it's very hard to say who is who. I would also say I don't think samurai stopped existing after 1960. There's still people in Japan who, you know, claim to be samurai and or train in like the samurai way.
Fantastic. Okay, one final question from Dylan. So the question is, do you think that Sir Elton John would fare well against the samurai as an idea?
I mean, he would fare well Yellow Brick Road, I suppose. I can't think of anything wittier than that. I don't know what you mean.
Great. On that note, thank you very much to our speaker.